Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through a story about deportation and what are the proper criteria to actually deport somebody. We've had this conversation before, or at least I've mentioned my views, but now we have an article from National Review which incorporates some of my views but goes a little bit further. It's an interesting one that's trying to delve into the topic while this is still a mainstream issue going on during the Trump administration. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So when you step forward in a court of law and you are asked, should this person be allowed to stay in the United States, what is your criteria? I think this, and let's assume that they crossed the border illegally. Do you have an opinion about what they do for a living? Do you have an opinion about where they're from? These sort of things. I want to know what your absolute maximum is, because these are conversations that we don't normally have. And when I say that, the left and the right in the broad political spectrum seems to have it, but not a one-to-one conversation, because there is a lot of nuance to this, even though I think the solution is pretty darn easy. But that's just my opinion. Of course, it is way more complicated than just saying, oh, it's really easy. So let's actually jump into the article that comes from National Review. I'm going to read you the first maybe two paragraphs after the headline, and the headline reads as such: "Yes, we need deportations without due process." So the second paragraph begins with, quote, "That's the obvious question raised by Joe Biden's effortlessly permitting millions of people to enter into the country illegally, and Donald Trump's having to go through extensive exertion to remove or even keep removed one illegal immigrant, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Abrego Garcia shouldn't have been deported to El Salvador, but the point still stands. Illegal immigrants can be imported by the millions with nothing more than a notice to appear and a bus ticket to their preferred destination, while there's a resource-heavy, time-consuming process to attempt to remove them by the thousands." End quote. And of course, it's not quite that simple. The asylum process was a little bit longer than that. There were holding places that some of these immigrants would have to go, but to pretend as though the process is exactly the same, or the processes take the same amount of time, is not true. And the legal challenges that were put up by lots of conservative groups were basically shot down and were not allowed, because it was said that the executive had the authority to not enforce this particular executive power that Trump had been using previously in order to limit the amount of people coming into the country. Even though technically that should be the legislator's job, it had fallen to Trump and he had used it previously, and Biden was able to easily say, no, we're not going to do it. And a lot of conservative challenges, though they did cause some problems, they did hold up the system a little bit, not to the same degree that Trump has had challenges hold up his process of actively deporting people. And even if you're to say, well, he still has deported people, if you look at even the lowest estimates, so let's say it's 500,000 people that came to the United States illegally. The number is projected to be more than that, but we're going to give it a really gracious chance here. When we're trying to actually argue the point, we're trying to give it the best case possible. Say it's 500,000 people that were allowed to illegally come into the United States and were given court cases and they didn't actually return to them in order to actually fulfill their asylum claim. And then you look at the amount of people that he's actually been able to deport, it's south of 5,000 at this point, okay? Then again, we are looking at a shorter time frame, so we can see how it plays out throughout the next 4 years. But the point being that the monthly estimates underneath Biden were sometimes reaching 90,000, if not more than that. So we cannot simply say, well, this is the way that the executive works out, because if it was the way that the executive worked out, it was actually how executive power was used and how it's checked through the judicial system, then we would see at least a equal application. We would see equal consequences and equal approaches to actually addressing the executive power and allowing for us to check executive power. And what I mean by that is, if this was really something that was a fair approach and they're not simply able to hold up one end of the process but allowing the other to go through without pain, then we would see a similar challenge system that would have been used underneath Joe Biden. We would have been able to see the judicial system used in the same way during Joe Biden in order to actively stop what was happening. Now, does that mean just because the outcome and the enforcement power of the other branches over the executive are being wielded differently, and therefore we have different inflows versus outflows, does that necessarily mean that you can justify getting rid of due process? No, I don't think that simple way of looking at it will actually be the solution here. Not only is that not rhetorically valid, but second off, this leads to the question of, okay, hey, so the people before you broke the rules, or the people before you didn't face as many challenges. The people in the other party did something that you don't like, and therefore, and did it maybe in a way that is not necessarily completely fair. And what I mean by that is not actually enforcing the asylum process and not deporting people that didn't show up for their asylum hearings, which is actually what would be the fair way to interact in that system that you're creating that's meant to actually be beneficial and allow more people into the country who have fair asylum claims. And then you unfairly abuse it by not enforcing the following up of the people who didn't actually show up for their court cases. Is it fair to then turn around? And when I say fair, that's a pretty, it's not the right word. Is it actually right to then turn around and say, oh, well, they abuse the power, we're going to abuse the power? No. And this is the tricky game that conservatives have played for a long time. They claim that Democrats break rules, and then they try to demonstrate how they should break rules, and then they get criticized for it. Then again, the Republicans have broken rules, the Democrats have criticized it, and then they've turned around and done the exact same thing. And they've gotten flack for it too from conservatives and from liberals. So, not trying to pretend though this is a one-way street, but I don't think this is the proper way to address this. One, on a principled level. Two, on a political level. On a principled level, you can have a very simple arrangement here. If the person who crosses into these United States does not have a visa or a green card or has a valid asylum paperwork, and let's be clear, I think the asylum system actually needs to be completely changed in that we would actually have admit less people there. The court cases, or at least with Zoom nowadays, you can appear at a court case from a different place, whether it be in Mexico, whether it be in other countries, and you can file for these things in those countries for the judge to be on a Zoom call in the United States in order to take these cases up. But let's say that we're going to actually allow the asylum process to stay as it is. Guess what? You don't have your asylum paperwork, then we are going to say, if you don't have that on you, or if you don't have your green card on you, or you don't have your work visa, your student visa, whatever visa it may be on you, then you have no way to prove that you legally came into these United States, and you will be put on the next deportation plane out of the United States of America. And guess what? If you are a valid resident, if you are a valid visa holder, you are a valid green card holder, then you can appeal, and then from there you are able to say, or you're able to say, well, this is my name, I can provide these documents to you. That is a version of due process, but at least it speeds up the initial part of actually getting people onto the list that should be deported. Because if we had to go to a judge every single time and say, okay, now we have to validate the fact that they claim that they're a green card holder, and we find out they're not, we just spend an extra week trying to get them into the next. It's basically the asylum system, which is all backed up with cases. We just spent an extra week wasting time, spending money and resources on them when it ended up being a fake claim. And guess what? There are going to be legitimate claims in there, and that is why we have the appeals process, and that is why they can hire lawyers. But if they cannot provide it on the spot, it's like having a reasonable suspicion for cops to be able to search you. Now, it's not necessarily, it is a violation of their rights if they search you without just, technically the term itself is without cause, but it's the same thing. If you don't have anything that can actually back up your claim, you don't actually have evidence to support your claim, then they have cause to believe that you are deported, and then the legal system can sort it out on the back end when people want to appeal for that sort of thing. Now, I understand people are going to get really fuzzy with that. They're going to say, well, does that go for everything? But my point is not to say that if the cop says, oh, They come. So we're gonna say they're gonna have you in a traffic stop, and they say, okay, I'm gonna get out of the car. I'm just going to search you, without any reasonable cause. They can still try to force you out of the car and search you, but then guess what? You can go through an appeals process. You can say that I was illegally searched, so on and so forth. So my point being here that with the barrier that I would put up there, that's a principled stance, and also it's a politically viable stance that you can actually win on, which is these documents you're supposed to have if you are a citizen, or sorry, if you are a resident who is allowed legally within this country, you're supposed to have these at all time. That's actually in the legislation in the first place. So from that point on, it's a very pungent, and pungent's probably not the right word to use here. It's a strong political case, which is, we told these people as part of the contract, you have to have these documents on you. We found you without these documents, and we were going to allow for an appeals process if you can prove it. But until then, we don't want to bog down the system. We will get anybody who's illegal out of the United States. So it effectively looks like there is zero due process, though technically there is a form of due process, because they're at least giving you the opportunity to present your card and information. And then you have obviously the due process that's allowed through the appeals system. But my point being, I feel as though that's a more pungent way to do it, and more potent. That's the word I would actually use, because politically it's a very potent message, which is, we are trying to uphold the law as it is stated. These people could not provide evidence that they should be within this country, and we will provide ample chances for them to appeal if they are a legitimate green card, visa holder, so on and so forth. And in this case, where I specifically laid out asylum holder, that they have an active asylum case that is going on within the United States. And by active, I don't mean that, oh, they had one and then they didn't show up at court. I mean that is still ongoing. They still have a court, either they're still going through the court process, or their court date is upcoming, because then at that point, you can say, okay, they haven't actually fled from the asylum process. They're not just trying to avoid it altogether. I'm sure other people will come in and criticize this from both sides. Some people will say I'm heartless. Some people will say I'm not going far enough, because it still causes delays if they file if they file an appeal. But if they file an appeal just to slow down the process and they don't have a visa or green card, there could be repercussions to that. So then it actually actively dissuades or discourages that sort of behavior. I don't necessarily know what that would be, but that is a discussion that can be had when we start to actually dive into it a little bit more. I am extremely sorry that my thoughts have been a little bit more disjointed on this one. It is later than I would like it to be, and I am coming back from a long day on the road. So we're trying to make it succinct while also getting a important message across, which is there is a better way to do this. All right. So with that said, let's jump into our daily delight. This story comes from Dog Time. The headline reads, dog makes snow angels and catches balls on epic snow day. And it's actually two dogs. So they're twin dogs. They both have their beautiful white fur, their coat, and they are going out and having the most absolutely joyous snow day. I know we don't get much of those anymore, going into the end of spring, going into the beginning of summer, but honestly, these two will bring a smile to your face. So if you want to read that article, watch that video that comes along with it, or you want to read the other article from National Review, both of the articles will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at your DailyFlip, where you can find the links to these episodes that come out on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, as well as the 6 and 6 episodes. Those are the 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. It's international news that come out on this channel on Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.